Generally be looking.
Good morning. On behalf of the Health Physics Society History Committee, I'd like to welcome a charter member of the Health Physics Society who will be telling us about his long and very productive career as a health physicist. Marlowe Stangler is, I think, best known to most society members as Mr. Civil Defense because he's been associated with the civil defense and with the early above ground weapons testing for so many years. And Marlowe, I'd like to say that the committee appreciates your spending some time with us and telling us about your very unique career. Marlowe was one of the very early AEC Rochester fellows, as I remember.
Correct.
That was back in the early 50s, wasn't it, Marlowe?
54.
And
53, 54, that school year.
What led you to being a fellow?
Purely accidental.
How so?
I grew up in a small town.
Whereabouts?
Waterville, Minnesota. Mm-hmm. Mankato is where the college that I went to. And I ended up, I guess, third in my senior class. All my high school teachers insisted I should go to college. And I really wanted to farm. So I started out in pre-agriculture. So in pre-agriculture, I get physics, biology, chemistry, and math. 2 years of that. Then I decided to stay there rather than transfer to the University of Minnesota. So by this time, I have a physics professor, Dr. Wissink. His son was also in this program. And he insisted when I graduated that I apply for this AEC fellowship in radiological health physics. I really didn't know the first thing about it. But if he wanted me to, I'll do it. So I applied for that, plus about a dozen assistantships to teach chemistry. Mm-hmm. And darn if this fellowship didn't come through. They paid me $133 a month just to go to school, gave me free books. How can you turn that down? So that's how I got into it. I accepted it. Went to University of Rochester, and Dr. Blair and several others of the profs there. Fred Olson was out at Brookhaven, and when I ended up at the summer program at Brookhaven for the 3 months.
And so you met Fred Olson there?
Correct.
And had you met Newell Stannard when you first went there?
Yes, Newell was there, Hoyt Whipple. You're taxing my memory. I tell you, I haven't.
Hoyt is was one of my favorite iconoclasts.
Yes.
Of the highest degree.
Yes.
It's too bad. We could use a health physics spokesman like Hoyt about now.
We sure could. We sure could. Definitely.
And so, who else influenced you in the Rochester program?
Well, you mean after I got there, or prior to that? Primarily Hoyt and Newell. Dr. Blair, I think, was running the AEC project. I think there were several other professors, but I really pretty much forgot their names at this point in time.
And so you went through the program.
Yes, I spent a year at Rochester, the 9 months, and then the 3-month summer program out at Brookhaven.
And at Brookhaven, who was influential?
Well, Fred Olson, definitely.
Fred Olson, who, by the way, that was a lifelong friendship, wasn't it?
Yes.
Because you two, as I remember, were close friends.
Yeah, he sort of announced my marriage plans before I really planned on doing it, because I didn't know if I was going to get married before I went to Brookhaven or after, and it turned out I got married before. So we were one of the newly married couples out there. We weren't the newest because Roger Cloutier got married 2 days later than we did. So, there were 5 couples in a upstairs of a girls' dorm. We had the whole upstairs, big community kitchen, refrigerator, freezer,
And they were all AEC fellows.
Yes.
You remember
Well,
who the others
except
were?
I think
it was Roger Cloutier and you.
Roger and another gentleman from the Bronx who had never seen popcorn popped, which we educated him by bringing some from Minnesota, worked in the gamma field. And the rest of us were in the program, fellowship program. So we had a very enjoyable summer at Brookhaven. Also learned about getting sunburned when you go out in the ocean and spend too much time in the salt water. So, but it's sort of really accidental that I got into this program. I did not plan it, but as things developed, I liked it. From Brookhaven, I then went into the Public Health Service, got a direct commission, ended up working with Dr. Cy Kinsman at Robert A. Taft Sanitary Engineering Center, better known probably as RATSEC in Cincinnati.
Right, and that was at the time one of the places to take graduate level classes in health physics. And there weren't very many places in the country at that point where you could do that.
Correct. We at Cincinnati we had the three. I guess we called them basic, intermediate, and advanced for simplification. Each 2 weeks in length. And first thing Cy asked me to do was to put together a list of questions, so they could do for evening. So I write up 100 math problems. Trouble was, I didn't have time to check them. And what my secretaries did to me, made a whole bunch of them to where you couldn't solve them. We had the first class I presented, we had 5 PhDs from the Food and Drug Administration come through. They had a pretty detailed little booklet, but they wanted some more training. I guess they spent most of that first night trying to solve the problems. I spent most of the second night trying to solve the rest of them that I hadn't assigned. So I've very much learned you review what you have typed before you hand it out and make assignments. But I enjoyed my time at Cincinnati. Ben Harless and Dick Cleveland ended up there. Fred Anderson.
Floyd Galpin?
No,
or was he later?
Floyd was later. I think there was another guy that went up to Shippingport where the first reactor was up there. I forget his name right now, but that was basically the teaching staff. Of course, with Cy Kinsman, you could tell where he was in the lecture by the joke he was telling. He had such a pattern down that it was unbelievable. I know of nobody else that has that technique perfected like he did. Enjoyed that very much. We spent the next several months after I got there going out to the weapons test in Nevada, which was 1955. Of course, I didn't know much about clearances in those days. My clearance lapsed between the time of leaving Brookhaven and arriving at Cincinnati, which took about 30 days. So they applied to reinstate it. Only I'd forgotten that when you get married, your mother-in-law and father-in-law are your relatives now. And I forgot to list them on the form. That held up my clearance for several weeks. But I ended up out in Nevada with on loan. I was in the public health service.
And that was in what, 55?
This was 55.
So that was what, Teapot? That would be Teapot, yeah.
And I worked for the University of California people, and we were on the arc that collected fallout. We had a 1.5 ton truck that we drove all over Nevada, probably about 10,000 miles, I think.
Sticky paper?
Sticky paper, air samplers, 3 or 4 barrels of gasoline, just so we wouldn't run out. put out a motor generator, had air samplers, and
Now, where was this data going? Was this going to NRL?
no, this was really collected by the public. Well, it was going to University of California is the one that wanted it, but the PHS people also wanted the data, the answers, and I think those were the two main sources of requesting that kind of information in those days. We had a number of other PHS people that were stationed in the various communities, like St. George and whatnot, that's been made fairly famous. I still remember the canteen freezing under the front seat of the truck.
When you were up on the mesas?
Yeah, we had some cold weather there, and
I remember that.
we started in late January, and I guess it was June or July before I got done. The shots were spectacular. I mean, I doubt that I'll ever see anything like that again. I hope I don't see anything like that again.
They were.
Let's put it
Now,
that
you
way.
were there for Plum Bob too, weren't you?
I was there for Plum Bob, which was in 57. And
Now, wasn't Al Brodsky associated with that too?
Al Brodsky was one of my helpers. He came to the agency, FCDA, in those days, Federal Civil Defense Administration. And I had him help me train some firemen and policemen who were basically first responders, I guess, this day and age. Gave him some information on using instruments and doing monitoring and whatnot. I think Alan took one group right out through ground zero. If you keep moving and don't stop too long, you don't get much exposure. Emphasize the factor of time very well.
Because as I remember, there was no beta dosimetry practice in those days.
Correct. We didn't. We
So
had
it
film
was only
badges.
gamma and
Gamma.
thermal neutrons were all they were capable of, as I remember.
Well, I think the only badges they checked us for was gamma because we.
Well, I think they had a little cadmium clip on them.
They probably, yes.
As I remember. Like,
But
I was out there
they-
at the same time.
They didn't let us get too close to where we'd get any neutrons. But I
It was
did.
pretty crude, but they could do some neutrons.
Yes, I did see a number of the shots. They were beautiful.
Now, were you there for Teapot and Plum Bob? How about Hardtack?
Hardtack was in 58.
Were you there for
I
that?
was there just shortly. By that time, this was my fourth weapons series, and I basically got some other people to go that were in the office. I'd already been out to Red Wing in the Pacific in 56. Was with the Hasselt group out of New York.
John Harley's group.
John Hurley, Harry Levine, Bob Graveson, and we flew in, had scintillation equipment, and we flew in the Navy's P-2V5 Neptune patrol bombers. Of course, they didn't bother to unload the depth charges. They kept them.
And this is
ready to
what,
go.
late 50s?
This was 56, yeah. Got out there sometime in about April, I guess, and
Because scintillation detectors were rare then.
yes, but I think they were probably on the cutting edge, and Hassett was one of the labs that was doing
Oh, well,
that.
John Harley was always on the cutting edge.
Right.
There's no doubt about that.
When Civil Defense went to buying aerial monitoring equipment, we switched and went to the cheaper version of Geiger counters, and had three of them basically tied together, three different detectors. Probably should have mentioned that in between, I got transferred from Cincinnati up to Battle Creek, Michigan, with the Federal Civil Defense Administration. That was about April of 56, and immediately I ended up going out to Pacific. Enjoyed that very much.
Now, you were on shipboard during these, or were
Basically
you on the
stationed,
atolls?
basically stationed in Anahuac, Elmer, or Fred. I got over to Bikini 2 or 3 times, and when I did, we usually ended up on the command ship. I think it was Estes. They'd pull off maybe 30 miles from the atoll, and we always were fortunate enough to have the glasses so we could see the detonations. I remember the one trip when we took off, lost a motor. And I think that's the biggest circle at the lowest level, just a few feet above the water. But we came back to the runway and made it, no problem. But
Phew.
you remember things like that.
Yeah, you sure do. Now, so you were there for a number of detonations in the Pacific?
Yes.
Because I remember there was one underground one that was particularly spectacular. Underwater one.
Yes.
It was particularly spectacular.
Yes. I'd almost say they all were spectacular, at least in my opinion back in those days. I thought they were. There's one I really didn't see. This was the airdrop by the Air Force. I think it was the first actual weapon that was airdropped. They were about 10 miles off target. So I think we saw the explosion, but I didn't see anything up close on that one. But there were some lagoon shots on barges. There were some shots on the atolls, both Bikini and Eniwetok. And that was an enjoyable series.
And you were mostly doing fallout surveys?
Yes, we were trying to see if we could find where the fallout went. We also learned the difference between from and to in terms of trying to give people directions. Because we ended up being 180 degrees from where we were supposed to be one time. Didn't make that mistake again, but communications can be very critical. But yes, we tried to find the fallout. If it was in the ocean, it was concentrated enough to where with the scintillation equipment that they had, we could find it.
Now, at this point, you were no longer responsible for giving classes, or were you?
Yes, I was. I wasn't with the Public Health Service anymore, but I was primarily sent up to Battle Creek, Michigan to work with Jack Dreen and Jim Buchanan on establishing a radiological defense training program. And I guess I'd been up there for 2 or 3 courses, and they liked me, so I got transferred. And I physically replaced Roscoe Goki. I don't know if you remember him.
Wow,
he was
I've
one
heard
of the,
that name for a long time.
was one of the PHS people. Dr. Ed Williams was up there, one of the medics, and we developed 3-4 training programs. One was primarily for radiological monitors. One was for radiological defense officers. One was more general. We called it radiological aspects of civil defense, to try and educate mayors, politicians, anybody that wanted to know more about fallout, weapons, etc. After we developed those first courses, then I ended up putting on a lot of courses around the country using the instruments, the civil defense sources we had, Cobalt 60, 30 millicuries. FCDA then established a radiological defense school. There was a guy by the name of Dr. Renner from Illinois University that was brought in to head that up. I worked with him for a couple years. There was a gentleman by the name of Dave McLaughlin that was brought in, who'd been one of his students, very knowledgeable, and so they took over the training program, and I ended up reverting back to working for Jim Buchanan on various projects involving shielding, instrumentation, basically the whole 9 yards with civil defense. If it involved radiation, I probably had my fingers in it to a little bit. So we developed instrumentation, calibrators. Prior to '58, we could only buy equipment and grant it to the states for training purposes. In '58, the Ostertag Amendment allowed civil defense to buy equipment and use it for operational purposes. So that's when the big procurement started. We bought a lot of equipment. We probably
You initially were using the Navy calibrators, the 100 curie.
Right.
There were 100 curie cesium
Right, we had the
sources.
so-called UDM-1As.
Yeah, the
which
UDM-1A,
were,
which is the old Navy one, which was
right,
well designed and
yes.
sailor-proof.
We had, yeah, well, not too sailor-proof,
nothing was sailor-proof.
but I made the mistake of calling it admiral-proof one time, but that was a mistake. We had 20 of them. One was sent to St. Procopius College, Dr. Shanka.
I knew Joe Shanka. Wonderful
And
gentleman.
very good. And most of those are still out in the States somewhere. I have a list, I think, back at home. I don't have it memorized. But after we made the large procurement of the ion chambers, we were developing calibrators, and the first one, after the one, the problem with the UDM-1A is you had to have pretty much a shielded room, and a fairly large one to minimize scatter.
You know, a big beam stop you
Big
needed.
beam,
yes.
right. And so we tried to develop something that was more or less self-contained. We could put the instruments in, push, pull, click, click, and calibrate them.
Closet calibrator.
Right. So we had Nick Anton develop one. It had about 9 slides.
That's from Anton Instruments?
Yes.
The Anton tubes?
And the problem with that is with basically what I have in my pocket, pen, I could bypass all the interlocks. So we didn't particularly like that design. We didn't have any better ones, so we tried to order some through GSA, and not knowing much about government procurement and so forth, GSA gave the money to the Corps of Engineers, and the Corps of Engineers didn't obligate it before the end of the fiscal year. So as a result, we never did buy the calibrators. By that time, we were progressing on 2 avenues. We bought some of the mercury column calibrators that the Navy had, which Wendell Character had worked on. This was from AMF. And we bought 10 of those. The problem with those is it was 60 turns on a little handle from 0 R/hour in the chamber to 400 R/hour in the chamber, and then 60 turns the other way. So every time you put the instrument in, you had 120 times. So that's when I got a little sewing machine motor and a few micro switches, and we automated them. But we only bought 10 of those, and we started a maintenance program really for civil defense in 64, 65. Had it fully implemented in all the states, I think, by 66. We had worked with Tech Ops Incorporated out of Burlington, Massachusetts, Dr. Eric Clark.
Yeah, very well-known
And
instrument man.
he came up with a design of a calibrator, which there's still about 35 of those that are still out in the States. And it basically had a large cesium source with a wheel that had different amounts of shielding, which allowed you to get a 0.4, 4, 40, and 400 R/hour in the chamber at the center of it. And except when you turned it to the open spot, that was the only way you could get the lead glass door open. Other than that, there was no way to get into that one. It's what I would call the Navy proof type version. And we bought 67 of those. Eventually we gave the UDM-1As to the States. The 10 mercury column calibrators we gave back to the Navy. And we ended up using this Tech Ops calibrator as a, called it CDV 794, as a major calibrator. The reason we needed something that you could do a push-pull, we had a remote controls where we could get into the calibration pots. And we had specified the location and the number of pots so that we could adjust, we could turn the instrument on, off, circuit check, 0, and adjust all the calibration pots without taking the instrument out. So that once you put the instrument in, you could calibrate all the ranges and then take the instrument out, which really cut down on the amount of time it needed
Also much safer.
Much safer. It's what I would call Navy-proof because you could almost let anybody operate it. He couldn't hurt himself if he wanted to. Even if he sat on it, it wouldn't really be any problem. It was about 2 MR per hour maximum at the external edges. The reason we needed some automated system was in '62 we procured about $23 million worth of radiological equipment. And then in '63 another $4 million, and in '64 another $2 million worth. We had over 500,000 CDB 715 ion chambers. We had 100,000 CDB 17 ion chambers. The only difference is you could remote the detector 25 foot. We had probably 600,000 Geiger counters. We had 3.8 million 0 to 200 art dosimeters.
Wow.
Chargers, about 500,000 chargers.
Now these went out to all the states, right?
Yes.
The state CD departments, as I remember.
Yes. The only exception was on the shoulder kits. When we first started that program in '62, we issued those directly to the shoulders. We got an address for the shoulder, and we got the states to agree to let us ship directly to whoever that building owner was in the facility.
We should tell our audience that shelters were a requirement in the late 40s, and so there were thousands of them throughout the United States.
Yes.
And that each state was responsible for keeping up its shelters, and this radiation detection kit that you put together for an amazingly small amount of money, I might add, for the quality instruments you had.
Yeah, each of the ion chambers, well, all the survey meters were roughly $20 to $25, maybe $30 for the 715 because it had a remote cable in there. The dosimeters and the chargers, about $5, somewhere as low as $4 something. We got a lot of equipment for our money, I think.
And the amazing thing is that a lot of these are still working today. That's what amazes me.
There are at least 6 states that I know of: Massachusetts, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Arkansas, Texas, that are still using our calibrators. They're still using the civil defense equipment. Now, when I started the maintenance program in the mid-'60s, we bought a bunch of glass high mags to put in the ion chambers to improve the low range response, to make it stable.
These are high mag resistors, right?
You're right, 2.2 times 10 to the 12th, I think. And by doing that, we ended up having the state shops take the instruments apart, clean the circuit boards, put in the good high mag, put a little gasket under the box that covered up your electrometer to make sure there was no light sensitivity. And we really partially rebuilt them to make sure they would last a lifetime. And I think they'll definitely outlast me. I'm over 70 now, so I expect to see those civil defense instruments around for a long time. There's a lot of them that were still in our warehouse, and the program was closed down. We had 100% funded radiological instrument inspection, maintenance, and calibration program. And this was closed down in '95. In '96, they decided to close down our test facility up at, this is a J.C. Dreen facility that was up at Mount Weather. And so the equipment was stored basically at no cost down in Fort Worth, Texas. But they accessed it in 2001. In August of 2001, GSA sold it for surplus. There's a company, I don't know the name, but they're on the internet down in Texas that bought an awful lot of this.
Yeah, because they're putting some new detectors on them and selling them.
Yeah, if you want to buy civil defense equipment, go to the internet and put in civil defense or radiological instruments. The calibrators that we had, we asked the states whether they wanted to retain them or not. I had always kept the radiological material on loan. So it was government property, and if I had to call it back or replace it, of course with cobalt it decays, I knew we were going to have to replace those sources. We tried to replace the training sources with cesium, and we had some problems doing that. The calibrators we kept on loan so that we gave the states the option, or FEMA did, I shouldn't say we, I still think I'm with them, I guess. We destroyed 24 of the 67 in January of 2002. I tried to get FEMA to reverse their decision to do it, but been in the mill for about 4 years, and they insisted on doing it. But there are still 24 calibrators. There's still 43 calibrators out in the states somewhere. Now, in the case of California, I know they're at the Songs nuclear power plant. I could find out where they are, but I don't know from memory anymore. But there's only a handful of states that are still using civil defense equipment exclusively. For example, Virginia, where I live, they still have a maintenance shop, but they've talked the utility into buying them Ludlums and Everline, which match what the utility is using. And the utility is now footing the bill for the maintenance of this equipment and the calibration of it. Probably should have mentioned that we've changed our agency names many times. I started.
Oh yeah, you started with FCDA?
FCDA, Federal Civil Defense Administration. From there, we became the Office of Defense and Civilian Mobilization.
And that was when?
For 1 month. That was in
1 month.
61. Till Congress changed.
Oh, by the way, in that time, they had put the moratorium on above-ground tests.
True. The moratorium started in 58. In fact, that was the Hardtack series. Was the last above-ground test.
Right. And so you're one of the few people to see the last above-ground test.
Yes. Yes.
And then you actually also were involved. Weren't you involved with some of the below-ground tests where they had some leakage and you had to go look for it?
Yeah.
Tell me about that a little bit. That's a unique thing that most people don't know that ever happened.
There was the S-shot that was the underground one at
Nevada
this
test
was
site.
this was Teapot in 55, and we had been on the 300-mile arc, which is we had the long drives. Got through Las Vegas and Grand Junction and P.O.G. and Coweta and up to Ely. One night, we always had radio communications because they put a plane up in a relay. This one night, we finally got through, and we talked to the plane. They were about 25 feet from landing, and it turned out that the road had been cut about 50 foot ahead of us. If we hadn't have established contact that night, when we did, I may not be here anymore. But on the way back, we would go through, and then this shot you mentioned, the underground one, vented, and as a result, we've been driving the truck. Hadn't turned it off for 24 hours. We just keep filling the gas tank. And I went to check one of the stations because the motor generator had quit. So I get out, start it, and we sort of violated procedures because I was alone in the last truck. And I'm the one that saw the equipment wasn't working. So I get out, start the motor generator, come back to the truck. It's not running. I hit the switch, nothing happens. I have a dead battery. I have a radio that doesn't work. And so I took off running. As it turned out, I wouldn't have been under the fault anyway, but you never know that. But we generally required 2 people and 2 vehicles to stay together.
So how far did you run?
Oh, I don't know. Probably, I was in running condition back in the 50s, so probably half mile. They came back and got me because they knew I should be right behind them. And when I didn't show up, I didn't probably even run that far, but it was an educational situation. We also had a lot of trouble with vehicles. would go out the back way through Groom Lake, and often it would have 3-4 inches of water, a little skim of ice on it. Many of our vehicles had four-wheel drive, so we ended up losing a power wagon north of POG. We ended up losing our truck south of POG because I went back to see why they hadn't gotten there yet. I dropped the oil plug out of my truck. They threw a rod in theirs. We call for help. The site, they'll be out tomorrow and pick us up. On the way out, they go across Groom Lake. They decide to throw it into four-wheel drive, but they hit the winch. The power takeoff ends up knocking the oil pad off the truck. So we had 3 trucks disabled within 24 hours. They finally came, towed us in, fixed the truck. I was using it about 3 days later, but these are the little problems you run into. It was a real experience.
Now, you were working with an awful lot of people when you were developing these calibrators and instruments. It seems to me that weren't you associated with some people from the Bureau, from MBS?
Yeah.
Charlie?
Actually, that was more in connection with developing shielding analysis. With the Cuban Missile Crisis and President Kennedy in '62, we knew that we were going to be doing fallout shoulder evaluation, and we needed to come up with some better ways of evaluating buildings using the amount of mass and whatnot. Lou Spencer and Charlie Eisenhower were the 2 at the Bureau of Standards that helped us and did a lot of work in terms of putting together a simplified way of evaluating the amount of protection in a building by floor, underground, where it was. Yes, they did a lot of that. When we became OCDM, that was our name, basically after FCDA.
Office of
Civil and Defense Mobilization.
Yeah.
Then we were split up. We became the Office of Emergency Preparedness that went to GSA, and I went with the Office of Civil Defense, which went to the Secretary of Defense and DOD.
And what year was that?
Oh, that was 1962. And I moved to Washington from Battle Creek. And then a couple of years later, we got kicked out of the Secretary of Defense's office to the Office of the Secretary of the Army. And we stayed there until...
Any particular reason for that move?
Probably politics, but I really don't know. I think they just felt that civil defense didn't deserve to be part of the Office of Secretary of Defense. So they put us over with the Army, which I think is where we coordinated more, really. And we stayed there until we became an independent agency. We became the Defense Civil Preparedness Agency, and that was April of '72. And we remained DCPA until early 1979, when FEMA was created, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and so they put 5 agencies back together again. And now we have the Department of Homeland Security that's going to put 22 agencies together, and FEMA will be going into that agency. I wouldn't hold my breath on too many immediate changes, but there will be a lot of changes coming up. But we had developed really an instrument program thanks to Jack Green and a lot of the other people that were around in the 50s.
Now, didn't you work with Carl Siebentritt too?
Yes, Carl Siebentritt, worked with him when we were in Battle Creek. He was with Bendick's division of temporary loss of memory. But anyway, he came to work for the Office of Civil Defense in '63 63, I believe it was, maybe 62. And I worked directly for him. I had been in research with Jack Green and Jim Buchanan. I had some 30 plus projects, about $35 million, no secretary, a telephone, a Freedom calculator, which I didn't have time to touch. And I decided to switch over to tech services and work on instruments, which I thought was going to be more what I'd like to do. So I switched from research to tech services, and that's when I started working for Carl, and continued with Carl Siemendred, Ed Williams, Pat Ruggieri was in there, Bob Mothersoul. We had a fairly small group, but we had a lot of dollars and instruments that we had accumulated over the years. And eventually we set up our own test facility in 1964 over at the Navy Yard in D.C. And we built an entire lab basically to where we could, we had large calibrators, we had 1,500 carries of cesium-137, J.L. Shepard source. We had several 250 kV X-ray machines. We had one of the UDM-1As we kept there, and we moved that to Mount Weather, which was the FEMA relocation site. They now call it the Emergency Operations Center, and the Jack Green facility was dedicated nearly 90s, I believe, maybe late 80s. And basically that was closed out in September of 96. Most of the equipment was sent to either state of Ohio or to the Army up at in New Jersey. We had a number of friends in the military that we worked with. We're more than willing to give them stuff rather than see it totally destroyed. We could do almost anything. We had a complete machine shop up there. If you wanted something made out of, you name the material, they could do it, whether it was plastic, metal. We had temperature chambers, we had radiation sources, so we could do 2 or 3 things at once, pull a vacuum and irradiate equipment. But that's all gone. Never will be resurrected.
Well, in 79 or 80, when FEMA was formed, you had a new series of bosses, as I remember. Isn't that when you went to work for Hal Gott?
Oh yes.
Because he's a well-known health physicist.
Well, it didn't really go to work for Hal, but I worked with Hal and Charlie Ketchum in Battle Creek. They were the regional radiological defense officers. And then when I moved to Washington, we had a gentleman by the name of Liberty who retired from the agency. I think he left rather than not retired. And there was a vacancy at Albany, Maryland, which was our regional underground center, one of our relocation sites. And Hal took the job. We talked him into hiring him and bringing him down there. So he and I worked very close. He was one of the proponents of the predecessors to the computers, the cards that had all the holes around it.
Yeah, the punch cards.
You could clip out.
The old IBM punch
right.
cards.
Well, he perfected that for our agency to keep track of like sources and whatnot. And then, of course, the next step was going to computers, and we had a UNIVAC 1106 out there at Albany, so he worked with them, and basically he is the one that helped me computerize almost all of our radiological records. Yeah, Hal was very instrumental. Then he left and went to the AEC about 74, I think it was. So we keep losing good people like that.
Now, when you went to work at FEMA, didn't you have a series of reports to Congress that you had to prepare?
Yes.
That became quite a load?
Yes, when as a result of TMI, Jimmy Carter made an assignment to our agency, and one of the deals is we took over the off-site emergency preparedness program around nuclear power plants. Prior to that, it had been NRC's responsibility. So they detailed about 8 or 9 people over to FEMA, and one of the requirements was to report to Congress on a monthly basis the status of these 17 nuclear power plant sites, as to the preparedness, when they had their last exercise, when they had their plans updated. And FEMA was getting blamed for the plants not opening on time, which generally wasn't true, but we had to submit a joint report from NRC and FEMA. Fortunately, that got changed to quarterly, because on a monthly basis, I had trouble getting them out on time. So we did put a report together. I think that has continued through at least 95 or 96. I don't know if that's still being reported or not. Basically, there's no new power plants under construction. The existing ones all have operating licenses, so I think the need for that report is probably decreased.
Oh, yeah, I imagine so. Now, when did you start working with Joe Logsdon? Another well-known health physicist.
I've known Joe for years, but I've worked with him on a lot of documents like EPA 400 and whatnot. When
by the way, EPA 400 is entitled?
It's the PAG's
Protective Action Guides.
Protective Action Guides.
Which, by the way, is used for the fate of radionuclides in most of the cleanup situations around the U.S. today, I might add. It's a very important document.
Right, and it's under revision. Ed Tupin is working on revising it. Alan C.B. Richardson was the other one that was the author, main 2 authors. Joe retired from EPA in, either early 90s or late 80s. And almost immediately went to work for Ken L. Travis.
Who used to work for Joe.
Right.
At Electric Boat Company when I worked for Joe.
Right.
It's a small world.
And a small world. And so we hired Joe through Ken L. Travis, through Argonne, who was our main contractor for off-site emergency preparedness. And so Joe helped me put together a lot of our Rep 14, Rep 15 documents on guidance on evaluating exercises. He also helped me put together the 2 courses that we had in those days. One was really on plume assessment. One was really for the early phase, and the second one was for the late phase, for the ingestion type exercises.
Which are still being used today.
Which are still being used today. The only problem is they've now combined that 1 week, those 2 weeks into 1 week. And they give you about a 1/4-inch document that you have to do before you come. So you at least get a head start on it, because there's just too much stuff to really cover in 1 week. But they've gone to a 1-week course.
Now you actually officially retired from FEMA in '94, was it?
Yes, September '94.
But you've been active since then with FEMA, haven't you?
Yeah, starting in '95, I started going back, doing training again. It's where I started, so I might as well finish. FEMA still is supporting the Radiological Emergency Response Operations course, RERO, and the ARIO, which is the Advanced Radiological Instrument Operations. These are both 1-week courses, somewhat different, and they're put on up at Mount Weather, or FEMA's Emergency Operations Center now, about once a month, starting in mid-March and finishing in September, maybe October. We don't like the weather up there at Mount Weather. It's a little too nasty in the winter, so I have been helping them since '95, basically. I think as of September 2003, that'll probably be the last course at Mount Weather, because because they're unclassified. And I think all the training at Mount Weather will be classified after the Department of Homeland Security takes over. And the unclassified training will be moved up to Emmitsburg, EMI, which in this day and age we can run people with protective gear around, and I don't think anybody will bat an eye. In '94, I think we would have had real problems doing that at EMI. But I think the training will continue, it's just the location will change about 80 miles. There may be even a demand for more training, for more courses at this point.
Oh, I'm sure there will be.
Yeah.
And so if you were, and so you will, you've worked for the original Civil Defense Agency. It's gone through many name changes to FEMA, and now it's about to go to Homeland Security.
Correct.
I believe. What, March
Correct.
1st, is it?
They're supposed to be operational by March 1st. I would say they have selected a location in DC, a naval facility that's up in Northwest, I understand. I don't think it's that large, but it has barbed wire fences around the top, and so it'll be a secure facility. They've got secure communications, so they've got certain things going for them. I think it'll be, most agencies will basically remain where they are for some time, as I see it. But eventually they will become a single department.
Now, one thing that I failed to mention when we started this interview, which I should have, is that you're one of the few charter members of the society that is still active and contributing, which is an amazing thing, because the charter members means that you were brought on board about 56, as I remember.
Correct.
And so you've been associated with the Health Physics Society since 1956, and of course have seen an incredible amount of change over the years. And you've been active in the chapters. I know that I see you often down at the Baltimore, Washington chapter nowadays.
Yes.
But you've been active in many chapters over the years, haven't you,
Well,
Marlowe?
most of my activity has been in the DC chapter. I started out in Cincinnati. I actually went to the 1955 pre-organization meeting, or whatever you call it. KZ Morgan and Ella Anderson and other people from Oak Ridge. Yes,
Ed
other
Bradley
people.
was there. And
Bradley.
were you at that organizational
Yes,
meeting?
at
Because very
55.
few people were,
55.
were there.
But in '56, for the first meeting, I had to miss it because I was out in the Pacific. So that's one of the few early ones that I missed.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say, I'm a charter member, but I missed the first 4 meetings because Rickover wouldn't let anybody go.
And
Period. End of discussion.
I don't know that we had local chapters back in the '50s, did we?
No.
Certainly
Well,
none in Michigan that I can remember.
New York had one of the earliest ones, but again, I wasn't allowed to go to that either. Rickover didn't want anybody discussing the program, and therefore we weren't allowed to go to meetings.
So
So I had to wait till I almost, until I was head of the department. So that, so it was like 5 years afterwards that I was able to go to my first meeting. But you were at the initial. See, there are so few people that were at that initial meeting.
I can believe that. I think I primarily got involved in chapter activities when I moved to Washington. I moved there in January of '62. And you just triggered another thing. I remember I had Charlie Ketchum come down and Hal Gaunt, and the meeting was out in Columbia, Maryland. Grace, W.R. Grace, they had the delicious food, free beer,
Oh, yeah, I remember
whatnot.
that.
Remember those?
Yeah.
And I had been doing quite a lot of driving, and I left from the Pentagon, drove out there, and on the way out, I looked at my gas tank, and it was almost on empty. So Columbia had just started, and I pulled into a filling station. The guy had the lights out, but he was still there. I got him to go in the back, find the right switch so I could fill my car up with gas. But I've been in the local chapter since '62, and basically the Baltimore, Washington one is the only one I've been in. I've coordinated with the one in Virginia, but a little too far to drive on most times, so I think I've been to one meeting for the Virginia chapter.
But I remember you in the early days of the Baltimore, Washington chapter.
Yes.
Being there, we met, I guess, in the late '50s sometime.
I would
as a matter of
think so.
fact.
I'm not
It's
sure.
hard to remember back then.
You're right. There are certain milestone dates I can't remember, but like when I got married and whatnot.
Well, tell me, what are your thoughts about the future of health physics and the Association of the Health Physics Society and the Homeland Security? You see huge changes going on, obviously.
Yes, I think it's probably going to take an upturn because this meeting here in San Antonio, I understand, is probably one of the best mid-year
One of
meetings
the largest
in terms of
ones
attendance,
they've ever had, yes.
which shows an interest of the health physics people. In my rural training, I have met a lot of people, like I met several of the speakers at the courses, or some of the people that work for them have come to the rural and the advanced course.
Why don't you tell the speakers what RERO is, by the way?
Radiological Emergency Operations put on by FEMA at Mount Weather. And there's going to be more demand for this type of training. As a result of those courses, I'm now working with the Oakton, Virginia Fire Department, the McLean Fire Department, who has radiological equipment. They have a hazmat team at Oakton, a full one. They have a couple in the Washington area in the Virginia side. Some of the other fire departments have radiological equipment, but they're not a full hazmat operation. I see more and more of this. I've met with the Soleto, I think it is, and McBride's with the DC Office of Emergency Management. Soleto is a battalion commander with the fire department over in DC. He's been through our course, and I will be making more contact with them. They're interested in more training, more information, answering questions. If it hadn't been for 911, I'm sure I wouldn't be doing some of these things now that I will be doing and am doing. I would say that there's going to be a lot more requests for our talents, our services, our knowledge. I guess the one thing that sort of bothers me is the continuing maintenance and calibration of this equipment. I'm not sure our local chapters are geared up to handle that.
It's a lot of work.
For example, before I retired, I could have got anything repaired and calibrated. You name it, I can get it done. No longer being employed, and with our facility totally gutted, I don't personally have that capability anymore. I'm going to have to rely on other people that still have calibrators, have labs, and whatnot. So it's a matter, I think, of searching some of those resources out in the Washington area where I'm particularly involved. But I will be involved, I think, with Carrie Thomas, Department of Justice, and I will try and be more active in this. But I'd like to see more things being done sooner, I guess, is where I'm coming from. I hear a lot of words, but I'm not sure I see an awful lot of action. I think that's what Alan Brodsky was trying to say yesterday. He's frustrated to a certain extent that we can't get more things done now rather than next week or next year. But I think there's going to be a real role for the health physicists if they want to get involved. I was back trying to recruit health physicists to come into the civil defense program back in the 50s and the 60s. I can remember that after I talked to the people about what the job would be, generally there wasn't much interest for them to come. I think that's probably changing to a certain extent.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I no longer dread saying, well, I've been with civil defense. I think it's now become an acceptable term and much more popular than it was, 30, 40 years ago when I first got involved.
Well, Marlowe, thank you so much. The History Committee really appreciates your spending time and telling us about your career, because you are one of the few health physicists that has gone through most of the above ground and underground shots.
Yes.
and also been able to contribute with all the teaching that you've done over the years. And we very much appreciate this opportunity to put this on film. And the History Committee thanks you again.
Well, thank you for inviting me and doing this. Enjoyed it.